most important thing that you could have done today was come to shul. We will not be intimidated. We will not be chased out of our sanctuaries, our places of refuge. We will not stop davening. We will not stop praying. We will not stop hoping. We will not stop working towards a better day.
That's the voice of Rabbi Carney Rose, senior clergy at Winnipeg's Shaarei Zedek Synagogue, where the first Sabbath of 2026 was marred by the discovery that someone had spray-painted red swastikas and hate messages on the doors of the city's largest synagogue. And while the Winnipeg Police Hate Crimes Unit was investigating, Sabbath services went ahead Saturday with renewed determination, as you heard the rabbi tell worshippers. It's the latest in a current of Jew hatred that didn't go away over the New Year break, beginning with the shock of the Bondi Beach Hanukkah massacre, then more mezuzahs torn off a second apartment building in Toronto over Christmas, while in Montreal, New Year's Eve, there are reports of some anti-Israel protesters holding signs glorifying Hamas and calling for murder of Jews. In Toronto, the provincial solicitor general published a stern letter scolding the Toronto police for not doing a good enough job to handle what he called unacceptable anti-Israel protests at the Eaton Centre on Boxing Day and in Jewish neighborhoods of the city for the past 2 years, and warned them to do better on New Year's. As folks return to the office or to school or jump into their New Year's schedules, we've been busy taking a deep dive into what's in store on the political front for Canada's Jewish community. And while Parliament isn't sitting now and the House of Commons doesn't return until January 26, the community is concerned about whether our country's politicians will keep their promises from 2025 to tackle anti-Semitism, crack down on terrorism and hate crimes. I'm Ellen Bessner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Monday, January the 5th, 2026. Welcome back to a new year for the North Star podcast, flagship news show of the Canadian Jewish News, and made possible thanks to the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granofsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. So what will 2026 be like on the political front? We've convened the CJN's political panel for their take on both domestic issues and international ones. Joining me is our trio of experts. Dan Mader is the founder of Loyalist Public Affairs. He's a conservative insider, both in government in Ottawa and before that with Ontario provincial politics. He's also active with CJPAC and Friends of JNF Canada. David Birnbaum is a former Liberal member of the Quebec National Assembly for Darcy McGee riding in Montreal. He retired in 2022 and is now an active volunteer and political commentator. And Noah Tepperman is a businessman from Windsor, the third generation of that family behind Tepperman's, a chain of 7 home furnishing stores across southwestern Ontario. He's a past president of the Windsor-Tecumseh NDP riding. He's advised the federal and provincial NDP on Jewish issues. He's also on CJPAC's advisory board and was on the board of J-Space Canada. Here's our conversation. And just a note, we spoke before the U.S.'s stunning arrest of Venezuela's dictator, Nicolas Maduro, on the weekend. So it's great to have all three of you here. Welcome. Thanks for being here.
Good to be here.
Thanks for having me.
We have a great list of topics to talk about. And the last time we spoke was in April, the April 28th election. I'm not sure if you followed the recent research of Robert Brim about Jewish votes in the election. The study literally just came out where we thought all the Jewish voters were going to be so mad at Trudeau's policies on Israel, they were going to vote for the Conservatives. And that did not happen. In fact, it was the opposite. I'm wondering, how did we get it so wrong?
Well, I think we always will get this wrong when we forget about Jewish Canadians being Canadians, voters, family members, and taxpayers first. I think it would be unfair not to add the context of this past election, which was all about Donald Trump. We would have had a different prime minister if we weren't in that existentially difficult and absurd and surrealist situation. So I think that explains particularly why there was a disconnection from the Jewish issues that were so pressing.
I agree. There are very few single issue voters. And I'd say one of the things that being involved in politics and working a lot of campaigns teaches you is humility. The majority of voters vote for whoever they think is going to take care of things competently so that they don't have to think about the government for the next few years. And I think this election was a great example of that, where Prime Minister Carney really positioned himself that way. And I think a lot of people said, you know what, there is a big external threat. This guy's taken over. He's given us change from a PM we were done with, and we're relatively comfortable with him. And I think that's as true for the Jewish community as it is for anyone.
And I think in addition to that, because I agree with what both Dan and David had said, yeah, I think Mr. Polyev had, sort of hitched his horse a little too closely to Trump's horse in terms of style and content to a lesser degree. And if he hadn't done that, or if he had been able to sort of pivot his how he presented to Canadian voters more quickly, then maybe you would have seen that serve as a mitigating factor, but that didn't happen.
In January, there's a leadership review for Mr. Poilievre. We've seen a couple of really unexpected floor crossings in the House from the Liberals gaining a couple of seats. Do you think that Poilievre will survive and continue to be the leader?
Yeah, I think Pierre will be fine. I think that the party activists are very united behind him. As much as people are, there's lots of media speculation, journalists love a leadership race even more than they love a cabinet shuffle, and they love speculating about both. Pierre's still polling above 40%, which is extremely high in historical terms. He's still doing well. I think the Liberals are trying to create as much uncertainty because they would love to see him go, and they would love to see the party consumed by a leadership race. There's no heir apparent, which means any leadership would probably be another 10, 12, 13-person leadership race like we had after Stephen Harper retired. And I just don't think there's a lot of appetite for that within the party. This most recent floor crossing, we saw somebody who probably just was running as a conservative because he thought that was the path to get into power. When he found it wasn't, he switched to the party that was in power. And that's the best explanation I've heard for something that otherwise is weird and doesn't make a lot of sense. But I'm going to the convention in Calgary, and I'm going to support Pierre, and I expect that we're going to see the party rally behind him.
I want to ask you all about where does the Jewish vote go that supported what Poilievre was saying about Israel and his staunch support for fighting anti-Semitism if there's not going to be an election with 4 years of Carney?
I don't think that they necessarily need to go anywhere else. Jews who want to continue to support the Conservative Party, who want to continue to support Pierre Poilievre because they find that meaningful, I don't necessarily expect that to change, though I think how they present their opposition to Bill C-9 is going to be important to that, and that's a whole conversation on itself. But I think, looking at how you started this part of the conversation in terms of the Brim Report and how Canadian Jews voted, it's clear that Canadian Jews are going to continue to vote across a range of issues, and that as the party leadership in any party, addresses issues that are important to us, whether they're Jewish issues or just Canadian issues, is going to have us reflect on our past choices and whether we're going to continue to follow them or not.
I would just guess, I'm not that close to the Conservative Party, but I would just guess that Jews, again, are caught in a dynamic like so many other conservative supporters, which is waiting to see how the Conservative Party again becomes the kind of coalition it did between its more red Tory movements and its more traditional ones, which and obviously that traditional, more staunch wing, which is further to the right, is very much in control at this point. But I think there remains some real impatience within our community, like elsewhere, with Poilievre's leadership style.
I have to say I disagree with that. I think the issues that are going to drive conservative support are going to be the more hard-right issues. They're going to be issues like getting the immigration system under control. They're going to be issues like going hard on law and order. And I think those are not centrist issues. If anything, the party is going to rally to the right, getting really tough on crime and really tough on terrorism and incitement. And I think that the party has room to grow that way. And I think the prime minister I think he's chosen a smart strategy to sort of identify a number of these issues and try to do just enough that he thinks it will deal with the public demand for something to be done. But I don't think that it is going to be seen to be done as we continue to see, people arrested for terrorism being let out on bail almost immediately. That I think pressure is going to mount for more to be done. And I think that does provide an opening for Poilievre and the Conservatives.
But I think there are also two models of opposition that have been presented, in the last couple of years. In the prior government, you certainly had the NDP presenting one model of opposition. You have the Conservatives presenting another model of opposition. In the first model, you see a party willing to accept compromise in order to advance key commitments that it's made to its own constituency. In the other model, you have something that reminds me a little bit more of the Mitch McConnell Republican Party under Barack Obama, where it was a default no to anything that the government was going to propose, whether or not it aligned with the values of your own party or not. And for a conservative trending liberal party, that puts a lot of pressure on the Conservative Party, the same way that a left-leaning or left-trending liberal party puts a ton of pressure on the NDP. And that's going to be something that the Conservatives are going to have to navigate very carefully, especially as things continue to play out, as we continue to navigate a very different global economy that's going to be with us in this government and the next government and the government after that.
I agree with Noah on that. That is one of the hardest decisions an opposition has to make. I think in the last government, you really did see an example of the NDP try to work collaboratively with the government, try to find some things they could get the government to do that were their objectives. And it electorally did not work for them. I mean, it worked for them. If you think of the NDP as more of a movement than a party, it achieved a lot of things that I think NDP supporters wanted, but electorally it was disastrous.
100%.
I think, weirdly, Canadians say they want the parties to work together, they want more collaboration, but they don't reward it. They reward an opposition party that will attack the government. I think the Conservatives are still trying to figure out how best to tackle Mark Carney, but he is still very new. Canadians wanted change. Carney's definitely given them change, definitely in tone, definitely in style, but also in substance. And so the Conservatives are going to have to figure out how to deal with that. I think a lot of it is going to be about trying to show a gap between talk and results.
I need to interrupt because there's so many things. I need to represent. There's so many things you guys have brought up that we need to go back before we continue. Sorry, Noah. You mentioned Bill C9. Let's talk about it. Why did the Conservatives? I know why the Conservatives say they oppose it, but do most people understand this position when Conservatives have been screaming, okay, protect the Jewish community, more protection for the Jewish community, crack down on hate speech, and yet they're opposing it. And so I'm not understanding how this is going to play out in terms of Jewish listeners and voters. Anyone can start on this.
My immediate reaction on this has been the Conservative Party, specifically the leader and his deputy, Ms. Lantzman, have been politicizing anti-Semitism and capitalizing on the fears of the Jewish community for their own political gain from day one. That's certainly my opinion. I will not try and present that as a fact, but that's been my experience of it. I think we all would agree on the fact that it's easier to be in opposition than it is to be in government. Because when you're in government, yes, you have the priorities that put you in government that you have to look to, but you're also responsible for governing the entire country, not just the people who voted for you. You've got to be responsible for a range of provinces and constituencies that have different needs, and that means you have to compromise. And very few people run for office on a point of compromise. I look at this and say, as a community, we have said that our minimum, and this is a generalization, but as a community, we said that our minimum acceptable position is perfect. That you have to support everything that we want, and any failure to do so means you're the enemy. I'm familiar with that kind of politics. I see that on the far left side of the NDP, and I'm very worried to see that within the Jewish community because, frankly, it means nobody will be able to meet that bar. And something like C9 would not have happened without the Trudeau government. Are you going to recognize that or not? The Trudeau government was not perfect, but that doesn't mean that they were awful. They were certainly disappointing to probably, potentially to everybody on this call. But that's not a binary lens. And
you mean the Carney government, or you mean the Trudeau government?
I mean the Trudeau government.
On C9.
I mean the Trudeau government and certainly the Carney government. But if we make unconditional support for Israel, for the Israeli government, rather, a litmus test for Jewish identity, we ourselves are inflicting harm on the Jewish future. And that's a point by Rabbi Cosgrove from New York, somebody who was very outspoken against the far left, who was looking at our response to this and saying we have to work for this. And we have a range of Jewish issues, of which Israel is one of them.
David, you want to go from epicenter of hate speech and religious protection for people who say hate things under the guise of religion, because that's where it all came from, is Adil Sharkawi.
Yeah, without a doubt. Well, look, I think it starts with this law being like so many laws, good, and the enemy of good is the search for perfection. So I agree on that score with Noah. You have here something that, first of all, quite properly and urgently involves legislators and all Canadians in understanding that a problem that has most clearly and tragically manifested itself within Jewish communities across Canada gets dealt with by all Canadians. Some of the opposition to it that's come from those who would be characterized on the left, I think, is always worth paying attention to. I think our Jewish sense of justice through history has been so credible and profound because of our insistence on worrying about freedom of speech in the worst of times. So I think the debate in some ways has been healthy, but I think we have before us a law that is so necessary. It's not going to fix everything by any means, but it's the right place to get moving on this.
And instead of enforcement, we don't have a law problem in this country. We have an enforcement problem, and we have a government that stands from this pedestal to pour fuel on the fire of that enforcement problem. And I want to know from the member, rather than focusing on enforcement, why is it that he thinks this government is bringing in a bill that is going to be weaponized against the very community that it purports to protect?
We're talking about Melissa Lantsman, and you said there's no challengers to potential replacements for Poilievre, but she's deputy prime minister and a firebrand. So I'm just wondering, she's one of the ones who is active with Roman Baber in trying to kill this bill for many reasons, or amend it at least. So why do the Conservatives want this bill to not go?
So I think it really comes down to two things. One, the Conservatives become more the champions of free speech these days, and they're very concerned and very skeptical on government government action against speech. Second is they feel that we already have lots of laws. They're not being enforced. And I think third, one of the concerns among conservatives, and I think a lot of concerns among those in the Jewish community concerned about this, is it's going to be used against us more than it's going to be used against our opponents. And that's a real worry that you're going to start having people charged under this for criticizing terrorist groups, for criticizing Palestinian and Arab extremism. And we're still going to see people walking around through Jewish neighborhoods calling for the Intifada, and they're not going to be touched. Conservatives really have learned the skepticism the last 20, 25, 30 years, where in places like universities and other public institutions, conservatives are consistently punished for their speech. But then when it comes to, a pro-terrorist hate group, suddenly, oh, no, free speech, we can't do anything. And I think, therefore, conservatives are very skeptical about this.
Ever since October 7th, 2023, Muslim and Jewish communities in Canada have been torn apart.
I've known you for 20 years. You've been at my house for Shabbat supper, I don't know how many times. And for 1 second, you can't put down your friend and just hold my hand?
We're fed a constant stream of Jews and Muslims talking at each other, about each other, but rarely do we hear them talking to each other.
There was, why are you doing this? What's the benefit of doing this?
This podcast aims to do something different. I'm Avi Feingold, a rabbi and a writer with the Canadian Jewish News.
I'm Yafa Sakeja, a Canadian-Palestinian entrepreneur and volunteer with the Canadian Friends of Standing Together.
We're sitting down with Jews and Muslims, Israelis and Palestinians, from coast to coast and across the political divide, having difficult conversations in good faith.
We are not the Israeli government. Palestinians are not Hamas.
This is the place where we're both supposed to end up, Israeli and Palestinian, Arab and Jewish.
Subscribe to In Good Faith, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Look, we're going to be talking about the NDP. I wanted to bring it up earlier when we were discussing how you were saying it was disastrous in terms of how their tactics were politically. Noah, we're having a leaders race. I'm not sure how closely involved you are in this, but so before you answer, maybe tell us your sort of disclosure.
I have nothing to disclose in this particular race. Okay. I am not attached to any campaign. I certainly have my personal priorities or preferences or internal rankings, but
All right.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about that, because when you're looking at the slate of candidates, especially, Avi Lewis, the scion of the Lewis family, who do you think from the party perspective would be the best leader? And then who would be the best or the least worst for the Jewish community?
Technically there are 5 people in the race, though I think everybody agrees that it's either a 2-person race or a 3-person race. So in terms of which candidate would be best for the NDP, I think you have to look at that from a couple of different perspectives, because obviously anybody who's been paying attention to politics through at least one cycle of a national election and a leadership campaign knows that when you're running for leader, you should also be running for prime minister. And despite the fact that the NDP is in a 4th place position, that doesn't mean that they should not still be thinking about this. The other side of the question is from the perspective of engagement and membership signups and fundraising, in a leadership campaign, which of these people in the campaign is best for the NDP? And I don't know that those answers are necessarily the same person. I believe that from a membership signups perspective, that Avi Lewis is in the lead with Heather McPherson and Rob Ashton very close behind him and very close to each other. I believe from a fundraising perspective, they're all doing pretty well, but that Heather McPherson, I believe, has the edge. But this race is really stirring up things from an activist perspective. You are seeing every part of the party really getting involved and saying, who do we want? That's where the leadership race puts a lot of pressure on who could potentially be the prime minister, because you've got to be able to paint a picture of somebody who's not only going to excite New Democrats, but somebody who's also going to be able to connect with Canadians at large. Avi Lewis, from a place of the nature of his rhetoric, I think has really tried to moderate some of sort of the style part, the vocabulary, the emotion with which he sort of approaches it. But the arguments that he's making, the policies that he's advocating for, the sort of free traditional things that social democrat politics often push for, I think that those are things which aren't going to resonate with a lot of Canadians, especially at this particular moment in time when Canada, like so many other economies, is really walling itself off from the American economy, reinvesting in our own capacity, whether it's capacity for manufacturing, whether it's defense capacity, regardless. We are headed into a very expensive period. And what that means is the chances for somebody like Avi Lewis to be able to make good and deliver on those promises as a potential prime minister is very, very low. I also think Avi Lewis is the worst candidate for the Canadian Jewish community.
You mentioned free. So one of the things we have to talk about, of course, is Avi Lewis's stance on Israel and free Palestine, and Heather McPherson, very hard critics of Israel, IJV members.
So here's the thing with, because there's actually a third issue, which or sort of a close tangentially connected issue to that, which is his relationship with the Canadian Jewish community. Now, that is a relationship which is largely predicated on his stance on Israel and his approach on Israel, but it's a separate issue, and it's an issue that really only exists for him in this particular way because he's the only Jew. And you and I both know that Jewish identity is not built on a single thing. Jewish identity is not built on religion. Jewish identity is not simply built on culture. Jewish identity is not simply built on peoplehood. There are a couple of different models with which people look at this. And I really want to be cautious here because I'm not interested in getting involved in anything like character assassination here. Well, I know a number of people who are close with Avi personally. He seems like a really nice, well-intentioned person. And we also know that there's that cliche that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The way Avi Lewis dismisses the concerns of the Jewish community writ large, the way he presents his approach as being not only better, certainly different, but also sort of more correct and more righteous, is really an issue of concern to me, because it says to me that he doesn't either understand and or place a lot of value in sort of concepts of community, of Jewish community, that I don't really have a sense, sort of beyond his family and maybe, some friends, what connection he has to the Jewish community, whether it's the Jewish community in Canada, whether it's the global Jewish community, whether it's the Jewish community in Israel. I certainly know that he comes from a Bundist background. And that background has produced, really a range of perspectives. There are people who come from that tradition who said, okay, we essentially lost the vote, so we're going to move on with our lives. Israel exists. That's where the biggest or the second biggest Jewish community in the world is. And that's meaningful for us. There are a group of people who say, okay, I see that country over there, and I'm not going to take position on it, but I'm not neither for it or against it. It exists, and I've got no issue with that. And that's somebody who I would sort of consider to be a non-Zionist. And then you've got people, who describe themselves to be anti-Zionist, which most of us understand to mean the elimination of the state of Israel in its current state as the homeland for the Jewish community and a democratic country for all of its citizens. If you're an anti-Zionist and you believe in changing that structure, you're essentially agreeing to change that structure against the will of the majority of the inhabitants, which comes across as a pretty violent thing. And so I think one of the things we really have to look at is the way in which, Mr. Lewis talks to or doesn't talk to the Jewish community, and the way he talks about the Jewish community to Canadians. And I think that's something which not only the Jewish community should be paying attention to. That's something which I think all Canadians really want to pay attention to.
Did any of you, Dan or David, want to weigh in on the NDP and what the future is for them?
Sure. I mean, look, I think the NDP should have a bright future right now. We have a liberal leader who, at the very least, comes from the right side of the Liberals, who has, walked back so many of the environmental policies that Prime Minister Trudeau had championed. That should create an opening for the NDP. But unfortunately, I think the NDP have been in this debate for years as to whether they're a party of labor and the environment or whether they're a party of activists and protests. And it seems like more and more they're the latter.
Yeah, Canada works better when the spectrums are properly represented. So I think all Canadians have an interest in the NDP getting its act together. I frankly, I'm not seeing all that much evidence of that happening.
All right. As we're taping this in recent days, many members of parliament who tried to get into the West Bank and, crying that they've been blocked by Israel. And that's a whole other thing on who sponsored them. So we need to talk about, is the Liberal government getting it right for the Jewish community? And that's a broad spectrum on Israel. Is Carney getting it right?
I think he's getting it as right as he can, as any elected Prime Minister of Canada can get it right. Talked earlier about the seeking perfection. That's woefully unrealistic in this current situation, where Canadians have views that are not necessarily reflective of the majority view in the Jewish community. In fact, they're not. So it's straddling a line that's deeply difficult. This will be politically incorrect to say, but I do find it surprising that we have so much to worry about in the Jewish community, but we allow ourselves to take a pass on what many would see as our obligation to comment on the leadership of Bibi Netanyahu and everything that the Israel government has done. That fuels certain points of view in Canada without a doubt and across the world, and many views that some would suggest are credible but that are not helpful to the Jewish community. So in that kind of terribly difficult environment where where Israel's behavior is under a microscope and often looked at with a moral relativism that I deplore, we are stuck with our government having to reconcile all those views and all those realities with all Canadians.
But there's a lot going on there. I mean, I think on the subject of Bibi, I think people use Bibi as an excuse. In some ways, it would be better for us in the diaspora if Bibi wasn't there and there was a different leader, because I think a different leader would have fought the war exactly the same. If anything, I think a different leader would have fought the war in a much more aggressive way, because Bibi, if anything, is very tentative. But maybe people wouldn't have had an excuse. But I think 5 minutes later, they would have come up with some other excuse as to why they're against Israel. I think Carney's been extremely disappointing in this regard. I wasn't shocked. I mean, I think Carney is a European technocrat. That was sort of his sales pitch. And I think if you want to wonder what he's going to do, what would an EU official do in that scenario? And that's probably what he's going to do. And so it's not a surprise that he's bad on this issue. But I do think he's terrible. I think he's siding with Canada's enemies and against Canada's allies. I think Israel is one of Canada's strongest allies. When the people question me on that, I say, look at the enemies of Israel. They're also the enemies of Canada. The people attacking Israel would love, the terrorist groups, the Iranian axis, they'd love to hurt Canadians also. Israel is on the front line of that, civilizational fight between Western democratic governance and totalitarian Islamism. Back when I worked in the Harper government, liberals took the easy way out on that similar fight in Afghanistan and always wanted us to run away. And I think, you're seeing that again, where, we have a lot of liberals pretending that we are not in this kind of a civilizational fight. Carney, what I will say to him is I think Carney is very fixated on the economy. That is his priority. He doesn't want to really think much about foreign affairs and foreign policy. That isn't what interests him. And he sees that, I think, as a distraction from fixing the economy and, defending our economy. So we'd rather kind of push that away and just sort of do what's politically easy. But I think that is a horrible mistake. And I think Canada is threatened long-term by the same people who threaten Israel. And if we don't wake up and realize that now, we're going to be dealing with it when we get more things like Bondi Beach come into our cities.
Noah, what do you think? Is the current Carney government getting it right on Israel?
Israel is not Canada's most important relationship under the best of times. And we are not operating under the best of times. So for me, there are some people who are really upset about the fact that our prime minister has not gone to Israel, has not, had that kind of a conversation there with their prime minister. I don't think that that's a problem. I think that the prime minister here has had his hands full managing both internal politics and the restructuring of the Canadian economy. That's a pretty big deal, to be working on, for less than a year. And the fact of the matter is, we can look at the last number of elections, successive elections, and that all of which point to the fact that foreign policy, United States aside, that foreign policy is not the most important thing in the world to most Canadians, and that Canada doesn't currently hold the international position, the moral international position that it used to hold. If he had gone there, I don't know what it would have done for anybody. It wouldn't have changed conditions in the Middle East. It likely wouldn't have changed the way most Canadians, for him or against him, as far as his participation in the conversation about Israel and Palestine. Maybe I look at that and say he's smart enough not to waste his time. I'm willing to give Carney the benefit of the doubt in a really weird way when it comes to this conversation about recognition of Palestine. The state of affairs between Israel and Palestine has been just stuck for at least a decade and probably closer to 2 decades at this point. I will be open to many, many things that will change the current stew, that will add something new and unexpected to see what that can produce beyond stuck, because stuck is not tenable. Minimizing the conflict is not tenable. Returning to the status quo is not tenable. So if this recognition, which, Canada was like, oh, yeah, me too, on something that, much bigger players like France and the UK and others were really the drivers of, if this produces something new that is better for Israelis and better for Palestinians, then I'd love to give it that opportunity. I think that, given what his original statements were about the preconditions and the fact that those are still present, I think he needs to speak more vociferously, specifically about the de-arming and demilitarizing of Hamas, because right now that seems to be the biggest immediate problem that unfortunately seems likely to reassert itself.
Okay, so we're going to finally end, and I'll ask if you've had time to put together your wish list for the next year in politics. Can I start? Speaking of Poilievre and speaking of Carney, my number 1 or 2, either one would be fine, wish would be that they would finally give an interview one-on-one to the CJN.
I mean, I can't help but wish, because I think we're in such an existential situation that things south of the border change. There'll be midterms in 2026. I think they must be at least one step to starting to crumble this dictatorial empire we have to the south of us that pervasively affects us every single day, not only on tariffs, on the quality of debate, on the permissibility of looking at the rule of law as something relative. I think that's an absolutely existential crisis we're facing to the south of us. So I would wish for midterm elections in the States that change the dynamics over there a bit. I mean, how can we not simply wish that there be a total absence of the terrible anti-Semitic tragedies we've seen over the past year. It just has to happen. We have to get to a place where we can feel secure and normal in our lives in every corner of the world. And I'm sorry, I would say that I think Bibi is a huge part of the problem. So I hope for a change in government in Israel.
Okay, thank you. Noah?
Yeah, and my top 2 points I think are pretty straightforward. The first is that we end up in the NDP, that the NDP ends up with a quality, responsible leader who is able to revitalize a strong, responsible, professional New Democratic Party for Canada that is focused on standard of life and quality of life and security for middle-income, middle-class Canadians and working-class Canadians. I guess the other a close second, or probably a first place item for me, is that we address the issues of political polarization and the underlying issues that are driving political polarization in this country. And one of the things that concerns me is to see people who feel right, left, center, people who feel that our political structures are failing them personally, that they cannot look to political structures, to government, to politicians to drive the kinds of changes that are important to them fundamentally every day of their life. Because when voters feel that frustrated with government across the board, you have to look at that as a precondition to the kinds of things that drive the dangerous populist politics that we are seeing in the United States, to some degree in Israel and elsewhere. And that doesn't mean those outcomes are tomorrow, but we can't have those outcomes in our near to mid-range future. And third, for me, from the perspective of the Jewish community, my wish would be that we remember that the issues that are important to us as Jews, that our goal is for there to be no air between political parties on those issues, that they should be issues that any political party should be able to support. That is the responsibility both of politicians, to not turn us into footballs, but also for ourselves to not offer ourselves up as a political football. If our minimum acceptable target or our minimum acceptable deliverable is perfection, then we will be disappointed by everyone. It is very, very dangerous to put all of your hopes in a single basket. As a retailer, I cannot count on a single manufacturer or supplier to drive my business. And the same is true with politics.
Dan, one of the slogans that the Conservatives started the campaign in April was "Canada is broken." So what are your wishes?
My Canadian wish is that government start taking anti-Semitism seriously. And this is not a partisan thing. This is every government is failing of all stripes at all levels of government. And I agree, we shouldn't ask for perfection, but I think what we ask for is we want our community to be protected the way you would treat any other minority community. If you would not tolerate this against any other minority, you should not tolerate it against us. And that means things like premiers, including the premier here in Ontario, saying to universities and colleges and elementary and secondary schools, stop the hate or we stop the funding. It means saying, our municipal, provincial, and federal leaders saying to police chiefs, start making arrests, start charging people for promoting hate. And if you won't do that, we'll find another police chief who will. And it means our federal government start deporting people. Any foreigner who's arrested for these kinds of hate, for these hate marches, should be deported. This is something that needs all three levels of government to start taking this seriously. And, on a global level, I'd love to see the Abraham Accords continue. I think that was a massive achievement. If I had one wish on the global front, it would be that.
Thank you for being on the CJN's political panel. Good to see you all.
Thank you.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounded like for this episode of North Star, made possible thanks to the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. North Star is produced by Zachary Judah Kaufman, and Michael Freeman is our executive producer, and our theme is by Brett Higgins. Thanks for listening.